Lydia Harper sat hunched over her drafting table in her cozy Seattle office, the glow of her desk lamp casting soft shadows across the room. It was well past 8, but she barely noticed. Her fingers danced over sketches for a client's dream home. Curved staircases, sleek countertops, a perfect blend of modern and warm. At 32, she'd built a name for herself as an interior designer, the kind who could turn chaos into beauty. Deadlines were her lifeblood, and tonight's project was no exception. The clock ticked on, but time slipped away as it always did when she was lost in her work. Back home, though, things weren't so picturesque. She lived in a creaky old house on the edge of the city with her dad, Richard, and her brother, Ethan. Richard was 60, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a permanent frown, retired early after years of odd jobs. Ethan, 28, was wiry and restless, always glued to his phone, claiming he'd find work soon. Ever since their mom, Emily, died in a supposed accident a decade ago, tumbling down the basement stairs, Lydia had become the glue holding them together. Or at least she tried to be. She paid the bills, kept the lights on, and made sure the fridge stayed stocked. Richard chipped in sometimes with a little cash from random gigs, but it was never enough. Ethan? He'd mutter excuses about job hunting, but Lydia hadn't seen a resume in years. She didn't push too hard, though. They were family, her family, and that meant something, even if the air between them felt heavy most days. That night, as she finally packed up her pencils and slung her bag over her shoulder, the city outside was draped in a damp, chilly fog, Seattle's usual mood. She locked the office door and headed home, her boots tapping against the wet pavement. The house loomed ahead, its peeling paint and sagging porch a far cry from the polished designs she'd dreamed up for clients. Inside, the TV blared some late-night talk show. Richard sprawled across the couch, a beer in hand, while Ethan slouched in the armchair, thumbing through his phone. "Late again," Richard grumbled without looking up. "You work too damn much, kid." "Yeah, well, someone's gotta," Lydia shot back, half joking, half exhausted. She dropped her bag by the door and headed to the kitchen, her stomach growling. The weight of it all, the deadlines, the bills, the quiet resentment, settled into her bones. She didn't know it yet, but that night was just the beginning. The cracks in her little family were about to split wide open, and everything she thought she knew was about to unravel. Lydia pushed through the front door, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting her like an old friend. The living room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of the TV. Richard didn't budge from the couch, his eyes half open as he nursed a beer. "Hey, I'm home," she called, shaking off the drizzle clinging to her coat. "Sorry I'm late again." "We ate already," Richard muttered, his voice flat. "Leftovers are in the fridge if you're hungry." He barely turned his head, just enough to acknowledge her before sinking back into whatever show was droning on. Ethan didn't even look up. Curled in the armchair like a cat, his fingers tapped furiously at his phone screen. "Hey, Lyd," he said, flicking a lazy wave her way before his attention snapped right back to whatever game or chat he was lost in. Typical. It had been like this for years, her dragging herself home after a long day, them barely registering she existed. She swallowed the frustration bubbling up and headed to the kitchen. The fridge hummed as she pulled out a foil-covered plate, some dry chicken and mashed potatoes that looked like they'd been sitting there too long. She popped it in the microwave, leaning against the counter while it whirred. Her mind drifted to the numbers she'd crunched earlier. Rent was due soon, the electric bill had spiked again, and Ethan's job hunt wasn't covering squat. She was drowning, and they didn't seem to care. When the microwave beeped, she carried her plate to the living room and sank into the worn recliner. "Guys, we need to talk about money," she started, poking at the chicken with her fork. "Expenses are climbing and I can't keep footing everything." And Richard shrugged, his shoulders barely lifting. "Getting old's expensive, Lydia. I forget stuff, spend more than I mean to. Happens." Ethan smirked, eyes still on his phone. "Retail therapy, you know. I'll cut back next month, promise." His tone was so casual it made her skin crawl, like her breaking her back for them was a joke. She rubbed her temples, feeling a headache bloom. "I'm serious. We can't keep going like this." The words hung there, heavy, but neither of them flinched. She wanted to scream, to shake them out of their apathy, but she bit it back. They were all she had left. She couldn't afford to push too hard. The next day, she was back at her office, sketching out a new layout when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number, probably a client. "Lydia Harper," she answered, tucking the phone against her shoulder as she kept drawing. "Is this Lydia Harper?" a crisp male voice asked. "I'm with Pacific Life Insurance. Just confirming a recent change to your policy's beneficiaries. It's been updated to Richard and Ethan Harper. Everything's processed now." Her pencil froze mid-line. A chill snaked down her spine. "Wait, what?" she said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "Change of beneficiaries? I didn't authorize that." The guy paused, papers rustling on his end. "We received an application last month. Your signature's on file, dated 3 weeks ago. If there's an issue, we can—" "No, I didn't sign anything," she cut in, her pulse hammering in her ears. "There's been a mistake. I'll call you back." She hung up before he could respond, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. Her signature? How? She hadn't touched her policy in years. The room felt too small all of a sudden, the walls pressing in. She tried to shake it off. A glitch, a mix-up, something stupid. But deep down, a tiny, nagging voice whispered that it wasn't. Richard's shrug, Ethan's smirk. They flashed in her mind, and for the first time, she wondered if she really knew the people she called family. Saturday rolled around, gray and dreary, the kind of Seattle day that made you want to stay inside forever. Richard and Ethan had mumbled something about hitting the mall, probably to blow more money Lydia didn't have, so she had the house to herself. She decided to use the quiet to clear her head. Cleaning always helped her think, and God knows the place needed it. She started in the living room, dusting off the chipped coffee table and vacuuming the threadbare rug, but her mind kept circling back to that insurance call. Her signature, forged. It didn't add up, and the more she thought about it, the tighter her chest got. When she finished downstairs, she hauled the vacuum up to Ethan's room. She rarely went in there. His space was a mess of dirty clothes, takeout boxes, and that stale smell of someone who didn't care. She wrinkled her nose and started tidying up, more out of habit than anything else. As she ran the vacuum under his bed, it snagged on something hard. Frowning, she dropped to her knees and reached underneath. Her fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. She pulled it out. A dusty old flip phone, the kind nobody used anymore. Weird. Ethan lived on his fancy new smartphone. Why keep this junk? Curiosity got the better of her. She flipped it open and pressed the power button, half expecting it to be dead, but the screen flickered to life, a dull green glow lighting up the dim room. No lock, no password, just an open inbox staring back at her. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled through the messages, names and dates blurring together until one thread caught her eye. It was from Richard, sent 3 months ago. Bump Lydia's insurance up slow. Big payout, no red flag. Her breath hitched. She blinked hard, sure she'd read it wrong, but the next one hit harder. Ethan's reply. Keep her as our ATM for now. Drain her savings first. Her hands went cold, the phone nearly slipping from her grip. This couldn't be real. A sick prank, maybe? But as she kept scrolling, the words got darker. Richard again. Small doses of sleeping pills. Docs'll think she's just sick. Ethan. Got the stuff already. She's clueless. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, the vacuum clattering to the floor. Sleeping pills, she thought back. Those random dizzy spells after dinner. The times she'd woken up groggy with no explanation. The power outages she'd blamed on old wiring. That day her car's brakes felt spongy, nearly sending her off the road. Not accidents. None of it. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. She fumbled with her own phone, snapping shaky pictures of the screen. Proof. She needed proof. The messages kept coming, each one a knife in her gut. Change her bank pin, Ethan had written a month ago. She hasn't noticed yet. Richard. Insurance forms are set. Your forgery's spot on. Forgery, that's how they'd pulled it off. Her signature, her life, all twisted into their game. The final blow was from last week. Her birthday's perfect. Special dinner, big dose. Her birthday was in 10 days. A wave of nausea hit her hard. She clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. They were going to kill her. Her own dad and brother. The people she'd spent years busting her ass to support. The creak of the front door snapped her out of it. Voices drifted up the stairs. Richard's low grumble, Ethan's sharp laugh. They were back. Panic surged through her like lightning. She scrambled to shut off the flip phone, shoving it back under the bed exactly where she'd found it. Her hands shook so bad she could barely grip the vacuum as she dragged it upright. "Lydia!" Richard's voice boomed from downstairs. "Where you at?" She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing her voice steady. "Up here. Just cleaning Ethan's room." It came out too high, too tight, but she prayed they wouldn't notice. Footsteps thudded closer, and the door swung open. Richard poked his head in, his gray eyes narrowing as they landed on her. "Cleaning, huh? Looks good," he said, his tone oddly soft. "You okay? You're pale as hell." She gripped the vacuum handle tighter, her knuckles white. "Just tired," she mumbled, faking a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Think I'm done. Gonna crash in my room." He nodded, watching her a second too long. "Rest up, then. You work too hard." The words dripped with something she couldn't place. Concern, maybe, but it felt wrong now, hollow. She brushed past him, her legs wobbly as she made it to her room and shut the door. Alone, she slid down the wall, hugging her knees to her chest. Tears burned her eyes, spilling over as the truth sank in. They weren't just using her, they wanted her dead, and she had no idea how to stop them. Lydia sat on the floor of her bedroom, the door locked tight behind her. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since she'd bolted from Ethan's room. The flip phone's messages burned in her mind, every word, every plan, every lie. Her dad and brother weren't just leeches anymore, they were predators, and she was the prey. She wiped her face hard, smearing tears across her cheeks. Crying wouldn't fix this. She had to think, had to move. Staying here wasn't an option, not with her birthday 10 days away and their special dinner looming like a death sentence. She forced herself up, pacing the small space. Her eyes darted to the window, Rain streaked the glass, blurring the streetlights outside. She couldn't just run blind. They'd notice if she bolted now. Richard's weird stare, Ethan's constant texting. They'd catch on fast. She needed a plan, something to buy her time. Her gaze landed on her sketch bag by the bed. Quietly, she unzipped it and started packing. Her wallet, ID, a wad of cash she'd stashed for emergencies, her phone with those damning screenshots. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every muffled laugh from downstairs twisted her stomach. Dinner was torture. She sat across from them at the rickety kitchen table, pushing cold pasta around her plate. Richard shoveled food into his mouth, oblivious, while Ethan scrolled his phone between bites. "You're quiet tonight," Richard said, glancing up with that same fake softness. "Feeling okay?" "Yeah, just a headache," she lied, keeping her eyes on her fork. "Long day. Think I'll turn in early." Her voice sounded foreign, brittle, but they didn't push. Ethan just grunted, too wrapped up in his screen to care. Perfect. She needed them distracted. As soon as their bedroom doors clicked shut that night, she sprang into action. Moving like a ghost, she slipped on dark jeans and a hoodie, double-checking her bag. She grabbed a notepad and scribbled a quick lie. Got a last-minute work trip. Client emergency. Back tonight. It wasn't much, but it might stall them long enough for her to vanish. She left it on the kitchen counter, where they'd see it in the morning, then crept downstairs, avoiding the squeaky third step she'd memorized years ago. Outside, the air was sharp and wet, soaking through her hood as she hurried to the corner ATM. Her hands shook as she withdrew every dollar she could. $800, not much, but it'd have to do. Next stop was a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks away. She bought a cheap prepaid phone with cash, her breath fogging in the cold as she activated it under the flickering streetlight. No more chances for them to track her old number. Back at the house, her phone buzzed. "Richard, you up early? What's for dinner later?" The casualness made her skin crawl. She shoved it in her pocket unanswered. By 5 a.m. she was ready. The house was silent, the sky still dark. She slung her bag over her shoulder and slipped out the front door, locking it behind her like nothing was wrong. Her boots hit the pavement fast, carrying her to the bus station across town. She'd decided on Tacoma. Close enough to reach, quick, far enough to breathe. Her Uncle Daniel lived there, her mom's younger brother. They'd been close once, before Richard shut him out of their lives after the funeral. If anyone would help her, it was him. As the city lights faded behind her, she clutched her bag tighter, the weight of betrayal sinking deeper. She wasn't just running from danger. She was running from everything she'd ever known. The bus rumbled into Tacoma just as the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky a watery pink. Lydia stepped off, her legs stiff from the hour-long ride, her bag digging into her shoulder. The air here was colder, cleaner, a sharp bite that jolted her awake. She'd made it. Away from Seattle, away from Richard and Ethan, but her nerves were still raw, every stranger's glance making her flinch. She pulled her hood lower and started walking, her prepaid phone clutched tight as she punched in an address she hadn't seen in years, 1427 Pine Street, Uncle Daniel's place. She hadn't spoken to him since she was a kid, back when he'd show up at holidays with his loud laugh and stories about his Navy days. After Mom died, Richard had cut him off, said Daniel was too nosy, always asking questions about the accident. Now, standing on this unfamiliar street, Lydia hoped she wasn't wrong about him. The house came into view, a modest bungalow with a faded green door and a tidy yard, the kind of place that felt steady. Her stomach knotted as she climbed the steps and pressed the bell, her finger trembling against the chipped paint. The door swung open, and there he was. Daniel, 55, broader than she remembered, with salt and pepper hair and a face creased from years of sun and salt water. His blue eyes widened, locking onto hers. "Lydia?" His voice cracked, like he couldn't believe it. "Is that you?" "Hi, Uncle Daniel," she said, barely above a whisper. "It's me. Can I come in?" He didn't hesitate, stepping aside and pulling her into a bear hug that smelled of coffee and wood polish. "Jesus, kid, what are you doing here?" He shut the door behind her, his hands lingering on her shoulders as he studied her face. "You look like hell." Inside, the house was warm, cluttered with Old Navy memorabilia and books stacked on every surface. She sank onto a lumpy couch, her bag thudding to the floor. The words spilled out before she could stop them. Richard's laziness, Ethan's excuses, the insurance call, that cursed flip phone. She pulled out her prepaid phone and showed him the screenshots, her voice shaking as she read aloud. "Big payout, no red flags. Sleeping pills. Docs'll think she's sick." Daniel's face darkened with every line, his jaw tightening until it looked like it might snap. When she finished, he leaned back in his armchair, rubbing a hand over his stubble. "That bastard," he growled. "Richard's always been a greedy son of a bitch, but this, and Ethan's in on it?" His eyes flashed with something raw, anger, grief, maybe both. "Your mom, she deserved better than him." "I don't know what to do," Lydia admitted, her throat tight. "I ran, but what if they find me? What if the cops don't believe me?" Daniel stood, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You're not alone in this, kid. I've got a buddy, Marcus. He's a private investigator, used to work cases with me back in the day. He'll know how to handle this." He grabbed his phone and dialed, his voice steady as he spoke. "Marcus, it's Dan. Need a favor. Family stuff. Can you get here quick?" Half an hour later, Marcus showed up. A wiry guy in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense vibe. Lydia laid it all out again, handing over her phone so he could scroll through the photos. He nodded slowly, tapping a finger against his chin. "This is solid, but we need more to nail 'em. Cops'll want hard evidence, drugs, tampering, something physical. You up for taking this to them?" "What if they think I'm crazy?" she asked, her voice small. Daniel squeezed her shoulder. "They won't. I've got your back, and Marcus knows how to make people listen. You're safe here. Richard doesn't even know where I live." His grip was firm, grounding her. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't running blind anymore. She had a team, a chance. But deep down, she knew the fight was just beginning. Lydia sat at Daniel's kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee warming her hands. The steam curled up, but she barely felt it. Her mind was still spinning from the last 48 hours. Marcus had taken her screenshots and left to dig deeper, promising to call when he had something concrete. Daniel hovered nearby, frying eggs and muttering about how Richard was always a leech, even back in the day, the normalcy of it. Breakfast, a sunny morning, felt surreal against the nightmare she'd escaped. She wanted to believe it was over, that she was safe, but the knot in her gut wouldn't loosen. Her prepaid phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. "Marcus." "Lydia, you at Dan's? I'm coming back, got news. Big news." His voice was tight, urgent. She mumbled a yes, and 20 minutes later he barged through the door, a manila folder tucked under his arm. Daniel slid a plate of eggs onto the table, but no one touched it. Marcus dropped the folder and leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Found something in the house," he said. "Tacoma PD let me tag along after I showed 'em your pics. Searched your place yesterday. Found traces of zolpidem in the kitchen, sleeping pills crushed up in a coffee tin, and your car, brake lines were cut, not worn. Sloppy work, but deliberate." Lydia's stomach lurched. She'd been right. Those dizzy nights, that near crash. It wasn't her imagination. Daniel slammed a fist on the table, rattling the mugs. "Those bastards. I knew Richard was low, but Ethan too?" He shook his head, fury etched into every line of his face. "There's more," Marcus said, his voice dropping. He flipped open the folder, revealing a stack of photocopied emails. "I pulled some strings, got into Richard's old laptop. Cops missed it first time around. These go back 10 years, to right after your mom died." He slid a page toward her. "Read this." Lydia's hands trembled as she picked it up. The email was from Richard to some guy named Carl, dated 2 days after Emily's funeral. It worked. Stairs did the trick. Insurance is processing. $500,000 coming our way. Keep quiet, you'll get your cut. Her breath caught, sharp and painful. She read it again, the words blurring through tears. Stairs did the trick. Her mom hadn't fallen. Richard had killed her, staged it, cashed out, and walked away. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom didn't... It wasn't an accident?" Daniel snatched the paper, his face going pale. "I knew it," he growled. "I told the cops back then. Emily was careful, never clumsy. They said I was grieving, seeing things. But I knew that son of a bitch did something." His voice cracked and he turned away, gripping the counter like he might collapse. Marcus kept going, relentless. "There's more emails. Him and Ethan years later. Ethan knew. He was just a kid then, but by the time you started making real money, he was all in. They've been bleeding you dry, planning this for ages." He tapped another page, a recent one. "Lydia's next. Same playbook, bigger payout." Lydia's world tilted. Her mom, murdered. Ethan, complicit even as a teenager. Richard, a monster wearing a father's face. She pressed her hands to her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. "Why me?" she choked out. "I gave them everything." "Greed," Marcus said simply. "Richard's done it before and got away with it. Thought he could pull it off again." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Cops have all this now. Tacoma's working with Seattle PD. They picked up Richard and Ethan this morning. Found the flip phone, too. Idiots didn't even ditch it." Daniel turned back, his eyes red but fierce. "They're done, Lydia. Locked up, no bail. Attempted murder, fraud, tampering. Add your mom's case, reopening, and they're screwed." He reached for her hand, his grip shaky but strong. "You got 'em." She nodded, numb, the weight of it crashing down. Back in Seattle, Richard and Ethan were unraveling. They'd come home to an empty house, Lydia's note on the counter. At first, they'd shrugged it off. Work trip, whatever. But when she didn't answer texts, when her office said she hadn't shown up, panic set in. "She knows," Ethan had hissed, pacing the living room. Richard waved him off. "No proof." "Relax." But his voice was thin, unsteady. By the time the cops kicked in the door, cuffs ready, they were sweating, shouting over each other. "Too late." Lydia stared at the eggs growing cold on the table. Safe, yes, but hollowed out. Her mom's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime. And she'd lived with the killers. The fight wasn't over yet. She'd have to face them, testify, relive it all. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. Daniel's hand stayed on hers, and Marcus was already plotting the next move. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. They'd tried to bury her, but she was still standing, and she'd make damn sure they paid. 2 months later, Lydia sat in a Tacoma courtroom, her fingers twisted together so tight her knuckles ached. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every whisper echo. Across the room, Richard and Ethan slumped in orange jumpsuits, separated by a guard but united in their defeat. Richard's face was stone cold, his gray eyes fixed on the wall like he could stare his way out of this. Ethan fidgeted, his hands trembling, sneaking glances at her that she refused to meet. She'd spent weeks dreading this, reliving the betrayal, facing them. But now, with Daniel beside her and Marcus's evidence in the prosecutor's hands, she felt something new. Resolve. The judge's gavel cracked and the prosecutor, a tall woman named Claire Evans, stood up. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Richard and Ethan Harper, you're charged with attempted murder, insurance fraud, and tampering with evidence. How do you plead?" Richard straightened, his jaw set. "Not guilty," he said, firm and unyielding. Ethan's turn came, and his voice barely made it out. "Not guilty," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the floor. Lydia's stomach twisted. He couldn't even look at her. The trial unfolded like a slow-moment car wreck. Claire laid it out piece by piece. The crushed sleeping pills in the coffee tin, the sliced brake lines, the flip phone's messages plotting her death. She projected the screenshots on a screen, Richard's words glowing in black and white. Big payout, no red flags. Ethan's, "She's clueless." The jury shifted in their seats, some gasping, others glaring at the defendants. Then came the emails about her mom. Richard's cold confession to Carl, the payout after Emily's fall. The room went dead silent, the weight of it sinking in. Richard's lawyer tried to spin it, called the emails misunderstandings, said Liddy was paranoid, overworked, but the evidence was a brick wall. Ethan's defense was weaker. His attorney painted him as a scared kid under Richard's thumb, begging for leniency. It didn't hold up. On day 5, Ethan cracked. He took a plea deal, his voice shaking as he faced the stand. "Dad planned it all," he said, tears streaking his face. "The pills, the insurance, Mom, too. I followed him." "I'm sorry, Lydia." His eyes met hers, pleading, but she looked away. Sorry didn't erase years of poison. Lydia took the stand last. Her legs wobbled as she climbed up, but her voice held steady. "I trusted them," she said, staring straight at Richard. "I worked myself to the bone for them, and they turned me into a paycheck, then a corpse." Richard didn't flinch, his face a mask. Ethan sobbed quietly, head in his hands. She finished, stepped down, and felt Daniel's arm around her shoulders as she sat. "You did good, kid," he whispered. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. After a tense hour of deliberation, the jury filed back in. "Guilty," the 4 men said. "First for Richard, attempted murder, fraud, plus a reopened case for Emily's death. 20 years, no parole." Ethan got 10, his cooperation shaving off time. The gavel slammed and it was over. Richard stayed rigid as they cuffed him, but Ethan crumpled, muttering apologies no one cared to hear. Outside, the air hit Lydia's face. Crisp, free. Daniel hugged her tight. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice small. "The trial's done," he said, "but you're just getting started." She managed a shaky smile. Justice wasn't healing, not yet. But it was a start. Richard and Ethan were gone, locked away, and she was still here, breathing, alive, ready to claw her way back to something better. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a trap. 2 years had passed since the courtroom doors swung shut behind Richard and Ethan, and Lydia was finally starting to feel the ground beneath her feet again. She'd settled in Tacoma, trading Seattle's chaos for a quieter life. Her new studio, a bright little space with big windows and walls covered in sketches, sat on a bustling street downtown. She'd built it from scratch, pouring every ounce of herself into designs that turned houses into homes. It wasn't just work anymore. It was her anchor, proof she could create something good out of the wreckage. Living with Daniel helped, too. His bungalow had become her safe haven, filled with his gruff warmth and the smell of fresh dirt from his garden. At 57 now, his health was slipping. Years at sea had worn him down, but he still spent mornings tending his roses, whistling old Navy tunes. Lydia loved those moments, sitting on the porch with a coffee, watching him fuss over petals like they were gold. He'd given her more than a roof. He'd given her family, the real kind, not the twisted version she'd escaped. Then there was Ryan. She'd met him 6 months ago at the studio, a lanky photographer with an easy smile and a knack for capturing light in ways that made her designs pop. They'd clicked fast, trading ideas over late-night takeout, and now they were planning a small wedding for next spring. He'd proposed on a whim down by the waterfront with a ring he'd tucked in a camera case. She'd laughed through tears, saying yes before he'd even finished asking. For the first time, love didn't feel like a risk. One evening, as she and Daniel sat sorting through wedding invites, the mail brought something else. A letter, postmarked from prison. Ethan's handwriting. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope, then ripped it open. "Lydia," it started, "I know you hate me, and I don't blame you. I was weak, stupid, caught in Dad's mess. I'm trying to change. Therapy here, classes. I'm so sorry." She read it twice, her chest tight. Forgiveness wasn't there yet, not after everything, but a tiny part of her hoped he meant it. She set it aside, not ready to reply. Later, as she curled up on the couch with Ryan, she looked around, Daniel humming in the kitchen, the soft glow of the lamp, the life she'd carved out. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I'm happy, really happy." Ryan squeezed her hand, grinning. "Good, you deserve it." Daniel poked his head in, holding a spatula. "If you're happy, I'm happy, kid. Now who wants pancakes?" She laughed, the sound light and free. The past still lingered. Richard's silence, Ethan's regret, her mom's stolen years. But it didn't own her anymore. She'd survived, rebuilt, found people who saw her, not her worth in dollars. For the first time, the future was hers, and she was ready to live it.